functionality is also cultural. You could design a chair, for example, that's a bit too high, or you can design a chair that's a bit too low. In the sense that in some parts of Nigeria, people like to sit lower to the ground for spiritual reasons, and then just because that's how they grew up. But in the West, for example, there's a 46 centimeters ergonomic check-in when it comes to chairs, and they feel like that's the world standard.
Nifemi, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to talk to you about the world of objects that surrounds us. And your work revolves around meaning, on storytelling. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about the relationship of objects and narrative.
I think everything that exists has a narrative. There's a reason for things existing. There's no such thing as just designing an object. There is sculpture that you can just design to look at. But I think objects will always have narratives, and they should. Even industrial objects have narratives. There's a reason why, for example, Braun as a company and Dieter Rams doing simple, clean designs for a German consumer. There's a reason why your iPhone is clean with a touch screen, because of the technology that exists.
When you're working on meaning, right, you may have a meaning, right, but meaning can be unstable. You bring these objects into the world with a certain agenda, a certain narrative, but then ultimately you can't really control the reception, right?
For me to actually answer this question effectively, I would have to talk to you about how my practice is split up, with the commercial side and then an artistic side. And with the commercial side, I designed one of my first products called the LM stool. And this I designed for it to just be a stool where you would place objects on top of. I never actually designed it for people to sit on. People would sit on it, use it as book stands. And you can design an object with function in mind, but then people will eventually find another use that maybe you didn't expect. Another good example is even the design of a toothbrush. People used to brush their teeth, right? But then people also use it to clean like really, really tight corners in their cars. Now, when it comes to the artistic side of things, I create objects to kind of spark a dialogue, and then maybe I think of functionality later.
Some people don't know how to classify your work as an artist or industrial designer. Well, here, you yourself have just explained that you've divided the practice. Are there moments where one nourishes the other?
Of course, all the time. I think it's important that they nourish each other, they lean on each other. I use the artistic side as information for commercial work, and also inspiration for commercial work.
Now, your work deals with craft.
Yes.
Okay, and craft and meaning. Can you talk to us about how these things overlap, intersect?
Craft is extremely important within my own practice and within everyday life, because it has economic viability within it. It allows people to create objects that have cultural meaning. And there's this word that's been thrown around craft in itself, what's called tradition. I feel like people don't want tradition to be updated, but I think it's important because it's contextual. So it's contextual to place, time, and people. So how a pot was made in the early 19th century shouldn't be the same way a pot is made today, because there's new technology. They're new materials. So I think that craftspeople have to be as innovative as designers, which is why I also like to kind of bring the both worlds together.
Now, history informs the work both, as I've learned through your writings, kind of telling the story of the making of the work. So in the sense of kind of micro-history, right? Telling how things are done, record keeping. But then there are broader histories that I think your work explicitly or implicitly touches on. So talk to me a little bit about history in your work.
I think I'm always searching. I have a lot of questions. And one of the main questions I was posing was material and identity, and the material in itself being metal. So looking at that from the context of Nigeria, specifically Lagos and Benin, looking at the past, present, and future. So using bronze, for example, as the past, because bronze was something that we were very, very knowledgeable about and still is. There's a huge street in Benin. 9th generation bronze casters are readily available for the royal family, creating objects and also creating objects for tourists. In that first part of it, working with bronze, I was actually mostly playing a designer's role, but eventually playing a craftsman's role with all the finishing and some parts of the welding that I did. And then looking at the present was aluminium. So aluminium is very prominent within Lagos, my city, because of overconsumption in the global north and the fact that these objects that are secondhand goods are sent to Nigeria to be recycled or reused, or broken down into parts to be recycled and reused. And then copper, looking at the future, and then talking about the lack of refinements on the continent. So it's a way of like record keeping as well. So archiving the work and letting people know what was before and what is now.
In your work, for example, you have pieces that confuse or blend chair and lamp, for example. Yeah. So function also can be unstable in your work, right? Yes. Talk to me a little bit about how you deal with function when it can be blurred or maybe misinterpreted.
The way I've done some work in the past is one of me being extremely rebellious. And it's because I went to university in the north of England, and a lot of conversations were always around functionality and designing with the 10 principles of design that Dieter Rams shoved into everyone's face. Designing objects that were unobtrusive, etc. And it seemed like functionality was at the core of it. But functionality is also cultural. You could design a chair, for example, that's a bit too high, or you could design a chair that's a bit too low. In the sense that in some parts of Nigeria, people like to sit lower to the ground for spiritual reasons, and then just because that's how they grew up. But in the West, for example, there's a 46 centimeters ergonomic check-in when it comes to chairs, and they feel like that's the world standard. I explore with my work by making sure that I'm considerate to the context in which I grew up in. And that's why, a good example is why a lot of my objects are multifunctional. I grew up with objects being stools, chairs, lamps, sculptures. The cornerstone of good design, in my own opinion, is ethnography, carrying out ethnographic research, understanding cultures, having conversations. So without that, I don't think I would even be able to practice. And that's the fun part of it for me.
The essence of design, you said, is ethnography.
Yes.
Imagine I'm a great ethnographer.
Okay.
And a terrible designer.
Oof.
Okay. Can I still make good design? If I do this beautiful job of listening and seeing and everything, nevertheless, I don't have the skills or the craft as a designer to do it. Yeah. Could I be a good designer?
I think you could. I really think you could. I think design is a dialogue. If you pick up your phone and you're intuitive to how it's going to be used, it's because culturally, someone has taken their time to understand what the global way of usage is. From a technological standpoint with Instagram, where we're all just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, someone has done that research to understand that people get a kick from scrolling and looking through. So it's if you understand people, you'll be able to create good objects, in my own opinion, and good solutions, at least.
What about beauty?
Oof.
I mean,
good segue.
We got there. Right? So, no, but because it's a tricky question, it's a word that makes some people actually uncomfortable, which is strange. Yeah. But it is a word that makes people nervous. And I wonder, do you care about beauty?
Beauty is as important as functionality because beauty plays a huge function. I think beauty draws people in and then allows you to be able to do what it is that you want to do with the object. If the iPhone was terribly designed, no one would pick it up. We would leave it at home and we'll have our head.
It was called a Newton, by the way.
So I think beauty is important and has functionality within objects, for sure.
I'm gonna ask you to get specific.
Oof, okay.
Bad design. Because you can learn from bad design. Go back to your student days.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
We all have things we've done as students
Yes.
that we like more and less. What's the worst thing you did as a student?
So the worst thing I designed as a student, and it was also the best thing I designed, was actually these flat back football shoes. And the concept was that each part, it was like a kit of parts, and each part could like come off. The lacing system was just right at the bottom. And I'd seen that like recently Nike had done something similar, and I was like, it was a good idea, but it was terribly executed because the last days of submission, I made the top out of my hoodie, out of a random American Apparel hoodie, and used the American Apparel thread to like make the shoelaces. It was a terrible prototype. When I showed it to my professor as well, he's like, who would wear this? But I was like, yo, this is supposed to be a shoe that costs less than $1, and then you'd be able to take off parts and then replace it if you ever had to, instead of buying like a new pair of shoes. So it was a good idea, but terribly executed.
So are there any designed objects in your everyday life, right? Things that we come upon in our life, examples of poor design that you can share with us? Because I think there's a lot to learn there.
The iPhone is one that scares me because it came out with something extremely beautiful, but I think it has this power of, it's turned into vanity, where you're going through a thing where it's like Instagram, for example, spending so much time on there, having the phone being an extension of who you are in your life, and you've become, in my own, digitalized without you even recognizing. So I think it's good design, but bad evolution. Good design can evolve to something really scary.
Right, there's an argument made by Hal Foster, and he has a book called Design and Crime, right? And he says that good design is terrible because it ultimately allures us into doing things we don't need to do, or getting things we don't need to get, or buying, right? So he makes the case for bad design in a way, right? or saying that good design has become kind of just a tool for stimulating consumption, right? How do you feel about that argument?
I don't think so. I think I would disagree heavily, because I think if something is well designed, it can be passed down from one generation to another with use. We need more good design than 5-minute thoughts of like fast fashion, for example. But if something is well made and you have it from like a leather jacket that's well designed that you can give to your kids, and your kids can give it to their kids, I think good design is important, and I disagree with that notion.
Did you overlap it? And this tells me a lot also about the way you work. Because you overlap making, well made,
yes,
and well designed. Right?
Yeah.
In many cases, there's a huge gap between the design of the thing, the conception of the thing, the design of it, and the actual making of it. Right?
Yes.
You could design something well, and then it could be put together terribly.
Yes.
Very poorly made.
Yeah.
Right. But I think the fact, it's telling to me that when you talk about good design, you don't separate those things. Is that a fair characterization of what you do?
It's fair, because I think one thing that good design does as well is that it takes into consideration stakeholders within the chain of an actual product. So if you're designing an object, you're not just thinking about the end user. You're thinking about the maker, considering what it is that they can do and can't do. You're also considerate to the distribution. You're considerate to packaging. And then you're also considerate to the user. So good design really and truly should take into account all of those stakeholders involved into creating one object.
Is there one thing or one kind of project you would love to have a shot at designing in your career?
Yes, but it's too political to say, so I'll pass.
Okay. Well, since we've gotten you into hot water, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.